She did not knock. That was the first thing people remembered about Clara Doyle. Not her face, not her name, not the way she carried herself through a door like she had already decided what needed doing before her foot crossed the threshold. She did not knock. She simply heard a sound that no one else in that house seemed willing to hear, and she moved toward it. A baby was dying in the room at the end of the hall, and every grown adult on that ranch was standing in the kitchen looking at the floor. If you had been there, if you had heard that thin, ragged crying coming through the wall, getting weaker by the hour, what would you have done? Would you have waited for someone to tell you it was your place to act? Would you have stood there with your hands folded and your eyes down, the way the others did? Clara Doyle did not wait. And because she did not wait, a child lived to see morning. But that moment, that single, impulsive, terrifying moment, set into motion everything that followed. The respect she would earn, the enemies she would make, the love she would almost lose before she ever dared to claim it. This is a story about what happens when a woman nobody chose decides to stay anyway. If you've ever felt like you were standing in a room where no one was willing to see you, subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The wagon that carried Clara Doyle into Harlan County, Wyoming arrived on a Tuesday in late October, and the driver didn't bother to slow down as it approached Bell Ranch. He just stopped long enough for her to climb down with her bag, nodded once, and flicked his reins before the dust had time to settle around her boots. She stood at the edge of the property and looked at what she'd come to. It was not what the advertisement had described. The notice in the Cheyenne paper had said, "Established ranch, suitable employment for reliable woman, cooking and household management, room and board provided." That language suggested order, stability, a place that had its affairs in hand. What Clara saw in front of her was a house that had clearly not been properly maintained in more than a year. Shutters hanging at wrong angles, a front porch with 2 broken boards she could spot from 20 feet away, windows grimy enough to turn the afternoon light into something gray and uncertain. She had seen worse. That was the honest truth. She had grown up in a household where worse was the standard condition. So she picked up her bag, walked to the front door, and knocked. No answer. She knocked again, louder. A dog somewhere around back started barking. A man's voice told it to shut up. Boots on wooden floors, slow and heavy, getting closer. Then the door opened and Clara got her first look at Samuel Bell. He was taller than she'd expected. That was her first thought, which she would later be embarrassed by. That her first impression of the man who would change her life was about his height. But he was tall, and he was thinner than a man who worked cattle had any right to be. And he looked at her the way people look at something they were not expecting and are not sure they want. "You the woman from the advertisement?" he said. "Clara Doyle." She extended her hand. He looked at it for a moment before shaking it. His grip was brief. "You're younger than I thought." You didn't list an age requirement. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it. Something that had forgotten how to be amusement and was making an attempt. "Come in," he said. The inside of the house was worse than the outside, and Clara had the good sense not to say so. The front room had the particular quality of a space that had been lived in before and then abandoned. Furniture still in place, a rug that had once been patterned and was now just muted and worn, curtains that might have been cream-colored at some point in their existence, a coat still hanging on the hook by the door. A woman's coat. Clara did not look at it long. "Kitchen's through there," Samuel said. "Your room is upstairs, second on the left. It's small." "I don't need much space." "Supper's expected at 6. The men eat in the back. You eat wherever you like. I don't care." "Thomas." He stopped, started again. "My son eats at 5. He's on soft food mostly. He's 8 months." Clara had not known there was a child. The advertisement had not mentioned one. She filed that information away without reaction and nodded. "Where is he now?" "Sleeping. Rosie watches him during the day, but she's getting on and she can't manage the house and the child both. That's why He gestured vaguely, which she understood to mean, "That's why you're here. She'll show you the routine." Rosie turned out to be a woman of perhaps 65, compact and sharp-eyed, who looked Clara over the way you'd look at a horse at auction. Not unkindly, but with the specific focus of someone trying to determine if the thing in front of them would hold up under pressure. She showed Clara the kitchen, the pantry, the woodpile, the well, the schedule of meals and chores, the location of the medical supplies. She did all of this in about 20 minutes with the efficiency of someone who had been managing on her own for too long and was choosing to believe that help had finally arrived. "The boy's a good baby," Rosie said at the end of the tour. "Easy mostly, but he's had a hard few months." The advertisement didn't mention him. Rosie gave her a look. "Mr. Bell doesn't talk about the boy to strangers, doesn't talk about much of anything to anyone, if you want the truth. Hasn't been right since—" She paused, smoothing the front of her apron. "Since his wife passed. Little over a year ago now, childbed fever, 3 days after Thomas came. He blames himself, though any sensible person could tell you there wasn't a thing he could have done." Clara let the silence sit where Rosie left it. She had learned, young, that the appropriate response to grief that wasn't yours was to let it breathe. "I'll learn what I need to learn," Clara said. "You don't have to worry about me." Rosie studied her a moment longer. "I'll hold off worrying until I have reason," she said, which was as close to approval as Clara suspected the woman gave to anyone. The first week was plain work, and Clara was grateful for it. She learned the kitchen, its quirks, its stores, what was running low and what needed to be rationed. She learned the men. There were 4 ranch hands, ranging from a quiet, reliable man named Pete, who'd been with Bell Ranch for 6 years, to a younger hand called Declan, who was long on charm and short on follow-through, to 2 brothers from Nebraska who kept to themselves and did their work without complaint. She learned the house's rhythms, where the light came in and when, which floorboards to avoid if she didn't want to wake Thomas, how cold it got in the kitchen before dawn when someone needed to be up to start the stove. Thomas, she learned last, or rather, she learned him slowly, the way you learn something that matters. He was small for 8 months, with a watchful quality that seemed too considered for a baby, like he had already worked out that the world was something to be assessed before trusted. He had his father's dark coloring and his mother's eyes, at least according to a portrait Clara found in the hallway, a formal photograph in which a young woman looked sideways at the camera with an expression that suggested she had better things to do. Clara paused in front of that photograph more than once, not out of sentiment, but because she was trying to understand the shape of what had been lost here, what the house had been before it became what it was now. Thomas warmed to her faster than she expected. By the 3rd day, he was reaching for her when she came into the room. By the 5th day, he was smiling at her. That particular wide, unguarded smile that babies produce before they've learned to moderate their reactions, before the world has taught them to be careful with their enthusiasm. Clara was careful with hers. She did not let herself feel too much, too fast. She had learned that lesson in other houses, other situations, the lesson about attaching yourself to something you had no guarantee of keeping. She told herself that Thomas was simply a child in her care. She told herself that every morning for 2 weeks. She stopped being able to tell herself that on a Wednesday in early November, when she picked him up from his crib to find him burning with fever and shaking. She had never seen a child shake like that. The small, violent tremors that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his skin, as if his body was fighting a war on terrain she couldn't see. His eyes were open but unfocused. He made no sound. That was the thing that frightened her more than anything else, the silence where the crying should have been. "Rosie." Her voice was level. She was already moving. "Rosie." Rosie appeared in the doorway, took one look, and went gray. "Lord have mercy." "Go get Mr. Bell. Go right now and don't stop to explain. Just get him." She heard Rosie's feet on the stairs, heard the knock on Samuel's door, heard the exchange. Rosie's voice urgent and low, Samuel's voice confused and then alarmed. Clara didn't listen to any of it past the point it took her to carry Thomas to the kitchen, where the stove was going and the light was better and she could lay him on the table and see him clearly. She had grown up in a household with younger siblings, 3 of them at various stages. She had been the one, in the absence of anyone more qualified, who had managed fevers and croup and the various illnesses that moved through poor households in cold months. She was not a doctor. She knew she was not a doctor. But she knew some things, and she knew that standing still was the one thing you could not afford. She had a cloth in cold water before Samuel came through the door. He stopped when he saw Thomas. The blood left his face in a way she had never seen happen to a person before. Not gradual, but sudden, like something had been turned off. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and reached for the baby, and Clara said, Don't move him yet, in a voice that came out steadier than she had any right to. Samuel looked at her. Let me get this fever down first, she said. Moving him right now will only distress him more. Come here and hold his hands. Talk to him. He knows your voice. For a moment, Samuel Bell did not move. She could see him calculating, but who was this woman? What did she know? Why was she giving him instructions in his own kitchen? And she held his gaze and waited and did not apologize for any of it. He came to the table and took his son's hands and began to talk to him in a low, halting voice that cracked on the second sentence and held together after that through what seemed like pure stubbornness. Clara worked. She didn't allow herself to think about what she was doing in any larger sense, didn't let herself acknowledge the fear or the stakes or the specific quality of dread that settles in when you are the only competent person in a room and the thing at risk is irreplaceable. She just moved from one step to the next, cold cloth. Temperature check by touch, watching the breathing, watching the color, watching the small chest rise and fall, rise and fall, rise and fall. Rosie stood in the corner of the kitchen and did whatever Clara asked and asked no questions. Samuel talked to his son, steadily, in that cracked and stubborn voice. 3 hours passed. At some point after midnight, Clara became aware that the quality of Thomas's breathing had changed. The labored, uncertain rhythm had shifted into something slower and more regular. The trembling had stopped. When she pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, the heat had begun to recede. She didn't say anything. She couldn't trust herself to say anything. She just kept working, kept watching, kept applying the cold cloth and monitoring each breath. It was Samuel who finally broke. Not with a sound. He didn't cry, or at least if he did, he managed to do it quietly enough that she didn't witness it. But at some point in that long night, he put his forehead down on the edge of the table and just stayed there. And the sound he made was so small and contained that it would have been possible to pretend you hadn't heard it. Clara kept her eyes on Thomas. By 2 in the morning, she was reasonably sure the crisis had passed. By 3, she was nearly certain. At 4, she carefully lifted Thomas, warm and slack and deeply sleeping, and carried him to his crib. She stood over him for a long time with her hand resting on his small back, feeling the rhythm of his breathing, counting the seconds between each exhale. When she came back to the kitchen, Samuel was sitting at the table with his hands around a cup of cold coffee he hadn't drunk. He looked up at her. "He's going to be all right," she said. Samuel's jaw worked for a moment. He looked back down at his cup. "How did you know what to do?" "I've managed sick children before. Younger siblings, mostly." "You're not a nurse." "No." "But you knew." "I knew enough," she said, "and I stayed calm. Sometimes that's the same thing." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Rosie told me you took charge before I even got downstairs." "Someone had to." He looked at her again, and this time the look was different from anything she'd seen from him before. Not gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude, something more complicated, something that recognized her. "I'll make coffee," Clara said, "the real kind." She turned to the stove and she heard him make a sound that might have been agreement or might have been something else entirely. She didn't turn around to check. She stood at the stove and made coffee and did not let herself think about how afraid she had been. Fear, she had learned, was most useful when you saved it for after. When the crisis was over and the child was breathing and the man at the table had started to come back to himself, that was when you were allowed to feel it, quietly, privately, with your back turned and your hands doing something useful so no one could see them tremble. Her hands did not tremble very much. She counted that as enough. What happened in the days after Thomas's illness was not dramatic. That was the thing about real change. It rarely announced itself. It didn't arrive with ceremony or with clearly marked before and after moments. It arrived in the gaps between ordinary things. Samuel began to leave her notes in the morning. Not long ones. Short, practical observations about what needed doing, what supplies were running low, what he expected from the week. Clara answered them in kind. It was a strange way to have a conversation, but it was more conversation than she'd had from him in the first week, and she recognized it for what it was. A man trying to relearn how to include another person in his daily life. She did not push. She had been raised in the specific school of thought that says people come around in their own time or not at all, and pushing them only makes them dig in harder. So she did her work and answered his notes and managed the house and cared for Thomas and let Samuel Bell find his own pace. The ranch hands noticed the change before Samuel was aware there was one to notice. Pete, the steady one, started bringing his questions to Clara when Samuel wasn't available. Practical things, nothing that overstepped, but the kind of easy delegation that happens naturally when a household has someone reliable at its center. Declan made a joke once about how Bell Ranch had gotten itself a sheriff, and the two brothers from Nebraska laughed, and Clara pretended she hadn't heard, though she had heard, and she filed it away in the part of her mind that tracked how she was perceived here, whether she was safe. She had a well-practiced system for that. The tracking of safety. It had started when she was about 7 years old, in her parents' house in Ohio, in a family that was not cruel so much as chaotic. A father who worked hard and drank harder. A mother who managed everything in the spaces between her husband's better and worse versions of himself. A household where the temperature could shift without warning, and a child learned early to read the room before the room read you. Clara had been the oldest, the one who watched, the one who made the calculations. She did not, when she thought about it, consider this a tragedy. It had made her competent. It had made her quick. It had made her someone who could read the temperature of a room full of strangers and know within 20 minutes who the reliable people were, who the difficult ones, where the loyalties would fall if the ground shifted. That kind of knowledge was useful. She had been using it her whole life. What she was less practiced at was knowing when to stop using it, when to let her guard down, when to trust that the temperature wasn't going to shift. That was her particular flaw, if she was being honest with herself. She didn't relax, she didn't stop watching. Even when things were stable, even when they were good, there was a part of her that remained braced for the moment. They stopped being good, that kept one foot back, one eye on the exit, one part of her mind separate from the part that was present and functioning and apparently fine. She was not going to apologize for that. You didn't apologize for the armor you'd had to build. But she was aware of it. She thought that counted for something. Thomas, in the weeks after his illness, seemed to grow faster than any baby had a right to. I was pulling himself to standing in his crib by early November, and he said something that might have been a word, "da," repeated with great seriousness, which produced in Samuel Bell an expression so undefended and raw that Clara had to look away from it because it felt like witnessing something private. Samuel caught her looking away and seemed to understand why. He cleared his throat. He said that last week for the first time. Did he? First time I'd heard him do it on purpose, like he knew what it meant. He might, Clara said. They understand more than you think at this age. Samuel looked down at Thomas, who had lost interest in his syllable and was now trying to eat a piece of dried corn. Do you know a lot about babies? More than the average woman without children, less than any woman with them, somewhere in between. He almost smiled. She saw it, the edge of it, the beginning of what a smile would look like on that face. That's a very precise way of putting something that amounts to somewhat. I prefer to be accurate. I've noticed. She went back to what she'd been doing, mending one of Thomas's small shirts, which had acquired a tear at the elbow from some mysterious baby endeavor. And the afternoon continued around them, ordinary and unhurried, and she thought, this is the thing that can change a person. Not the dramatic moments, not the crises, the ordinary afternoons. She was afraid of how much she was starting to want this particular ordinary afternoon to be part of a larger pattern. She didn't let herself think about that. Instead, she mended the shirt and watched Thomas try to eat the corn, and listened to Samuel talk quietly about what the weather was going to do to the east pasture, and told herself that some things could be appreciated without being claimed. It was a theory she was still working on. In the third week of November, a rider came to Bell Ranch from the east. Clara watched him from the kitchen window as he approached. A man on a good horse, well dressed for a rider, the kind of careful presentation that said money or the desire to project it. He had the easy, proprietorial bearing of someone who was accustomed to arriving places and being welcomed. She didn't know who he was. She knew, looking at him, that she was going to need to. She set down what she was doing and moved to where she could hear the front door. Samuel's voice, initially neutral, went cool inside of 2 minutes. She heard a name, Harlan, which she would later learn was the name of his wife's older brother. A man who had managed to transform a modest family inheritance into a significant land operation through methods that people in the county described with the specific clipped vocabulary of those who disapprove but haven't yet figured out how to stop something. I came to see the boy, the man said. Clara heard the ease in his voice, the practiced casualness of someone who had said what he wanted and gotten it so consistently that he'd stopped accounting for the possibility of refusal. Margaret's mother is asking after him. The whole family is. You can't keep him shut away up here, Samuel. He's her blood. He's my son. He's Margaret's son, too, or he would have been if she'd lived long enough to— Don't. Samuel's voice had dropped in a way that wasn't loud but was absolute. You don't get to use her that way. A pause. Clara did not move. I'm not using anyone, the man said, and his voice had gone smooth again, the brief displeasure replaced by something more managed. I'm simply saying that the family would like to see the child. It's a reasonable request. We could arrange for him to spend some time. He's 8 months old. He's not spending time anywhere. This is his home. Of course it is. I'm not suggesting otherwise. Another pause. I've also heard you've taken on help. Samuel said nothing. A young woman, from what I hear, living here, managing the house. The man let that sentence breathe for a moment before adding, People talk, Samuel. You know how it is up here. I'm only saying that Margaret's family would feel more comfortable knowing that whoever is in this house around Thomas is someone appropriate, someone vetted, someone we know. She's an employee, Samuel said. That's all you need to know. Of course. Easy, smooth, patient. I'd still like to meet her, just to put some minds at ease. Clara turned back to the kitchen before she could hear Samuel's response. She put water on for coffee that hadn't been requested and didn't need to be made, and stood at the stove with her hands flat on the edge of it, and thought carefully about what she had just heard. She had grown up around men like that, men who always had a reasonable explanation for every move they made, men who were never, in their own telling, doing anything other than looking out for the interests of people who couldn't look out for themselves. She knew the shape of that particular kind of authority, the way it arrived wearing the clothes of concern and left wearing the clothes of having gotten what it came for. She did not know yet exactly what this man wanted. She knew it was not simply to see the baby. She poured the coffee into a cup she didn't want and stood in her kitchen and started thinking. Rosie found her there 20 minutes later, after the man on the good horse had ridden away. That was Harlan Graves, Rosie said, without preamble. I guessed. Margaret's older brother. Has money, has connections, has opinions about how other people ought to run their affairs. Rosie sat down heavily in the chair by the window. He's been by twice before. Never stays long, never says anything outright, but every time he leaves, Mr. Bell is in a darker mood for a week. What does he want? Rosie looked at her. What do men like that always want? Control of something. He didn't get it while Margaret was alive because she didn't let him. She had more spine than twice her size, and she told him once, in front of company, that his opinion on Bell Ranch affairs was as welcome as a skunk at Sunday dinner. The ghost of a smile crossed Rosie's face. He didn't forget that. And now she's gone. And now she's gone, and Samuel's been grieving and not thinking clearly about much, and there's a child involved that Harlan can use as a reason to stay interested. Rosie paused. And now there's you. Clara met her eyes. I'm not saying it's fair, Rosie said. I'm just saying that a young woman living and working in a widower's house is the kind of thing that men like Harlan Graves know exactly how to use. I know, Clara said. Rosie nodded, once. I thought you might. They sat with that for a moment. Two women in a kitchen, one of them young and one of them not, both of them understanding perfectly well the particular physics of a world that looked at women like them and saw either usefulness or inconvenience, and rarely much else. Then Clara picked up her coffee and took a sip of it, though it had gone slightly cold. Well, she said, I suppose I'd better make sure he doesn't find anything worth using. Rosie looked at her with something that had started as appraisal and was becoming slowly something more like respect. I suppose you'd better, she agreed. Outside, the wind was picking up from the north, carrying the smell of snow that was still a few days away but was coming. Clara could feel it, that particular sharpness in the air that meant winter had made up its mind and would not be negotiating. She thought about the broken shutters on the east side. She thought about the woodpile that was adequate but not generous enough for a hard month. She thought about Thomas, warm and oblivious in his crib upstairs, learning the word da and having no idea what his mother's brother was riding toward. She thought, there are things you can do and things you cannot do, and the only sensible response to that distinction is to be very clear about which is which. She could not control Harlan Graves or what he told people about her. She could not control what the county thought of a young woman living in a widower's house. She could not control the shape of other people's suspicions or the stories they chose to believe about motives they had decided in advance to doubt. What she could control was the quality of her work, the steadiness of her character, and whether the child in this house was healthy, clean, cared for, and loved. That was enough. That had to be enough. She went to find Samuel, who was out by the east fence, and she told him, without drama, that the shutters on the east side needed to be secured before the snow came. She said she'd also noticed the north storeroom door had a gap at the base that would let the cold in. She mentioned that she'd been looking at the woodpile and thought it worth adding to before the weather set in. He listened to all of this with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the horizon. When she finished, he said, "You noticed all that today?" "I've been noticing it for a while. I didn't think it was my place to say anything." He looked at her then, the same direct, considering look he'd given her the night of Thomas's fever, the look that recognized her. "It's your place," he said. She nodded. "Then I'll keep saying things." She turned back toward the house, and he followed at a small distance, and neither of them said anything else. And the wind came in from the north with the smell of snow, and somewhere in the house Thomas was laughing at something only a baby could find funny. That night, after supper, after Thomas was settled and the men had gone to the bunkhouse and Rosie had gone to her room, Clara sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea and the mending and the quiet of the house, and she let herself feel, finally, all the things she hadn't allowed herself to feel during the day. She was afraid of Harlan Graves. She was afraid of what men like him were capable of when they decided they had a claim on something. She was afraid of the particular vulnerability of her position, young, female, unattached, residing in a house she had no legal standing in, caring for a child she had no formal claim to. She was also, and this was the part she examined carefully, the way you examine a wound to determine its nature, she was also beginning to care about this house, this specific, imperfect, badly maintained, slowly warming house, the way the kitchen light looked in the mornings, the weight of Thomas in her arms, the notes Samuel left on the table, the dry, precise way Rosie said exactly what she thought, the sound of the men coming in from the cold and stomping the mud off their boots and arguing about nothing while they washed their hands. She was beginning to want to stay. That was the most frightening thing of all. She drank her tea. She finished her mending. She banked the fire and checked the doors and climbed the stairs and went quietly past Thomas's room, pausing as she always did to listen at the door. Breathing. Regular and unhurried. She stood in the hallway for a moment, her hand on the doorframe, and she made herself no promises she couldn't keep. She did not tell herself it would work out. She did not tell herself she was safe here, or that her place was secure, or that the things she was beginning to feel were anything other than what they were. Dangerous, inconvenient, and probably unwise. She told herself only this, that she would do good work tomorrow. That was all she could manage. That was all anyone ever really managed. She went to bed. Outside, the wind continued north, and the smell of snow grew sharper, and the ranch settled into its nighttime silence. Not empty, but full of the particular quiet of a place that is alive and resting, gathering itself for whatever was coming next. The snow came on a Thursday. Clara had known it was coming, had felt it in that sharpening of the air she'd noticed the week before. But knowing a thing is coming and being ready for it are different problems. And Bell Ranch, she discovered, had spent the last year in a state of deferred maintenance that left it underprepared for the kind of November that Wyoming was capable of delivering. She was up before 4 that morning because she had slept badly and because there was no point lying in bed listening to the wind work at the eaves when there were things that needed doing. By the time Samuel came down at 5:30, she had the stove going, the kitchen warm, and a list on the table of what needed to be addressed before the snow got worse. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the list and then at her. "You wrote this morning?" "I wrote most of it 2 weeks ago. I just added to it." He picked it up. She watched him read it, watched the small, controlled expression of a man absorbing the full picture of how far behind his own property had gotten. He put the list down. "I'll get the men started on the east shutters," he said. "The gap under the north storeroom door first. If that room freezes, you'll lose half the winter stores." He looked at her with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the one where he was deciding whether to be annoyed at being redirected or to simply acknowledge that she was right. He had been choosing the second option more often lately. "North storeroom first," he said. "I'll need more flour before the pass gets bad." and lamp oil, and something for Thomas's cough. He's coughing? Just a small one. Started yesterday. It's nothing serious yet, and I'd like it to stay that way. Samuel's jaw tightened in the specific way it did when anything concerning Thomas was mentioned, that involuntary clench that she suspected he wasn't even aware of. I'll send Declan into town today. Send Pete, Clara said. Declan will spend an hour talking to whoever he finds at the general store and come back with half the list. A short silence. Then, Pete, then. He took his coffee and went to find the men, and Clara turned back to the stove, and the snow continued to come down outside the window, steady and indifferent, and she thought, we are learning how to do this. The two of us. We are learning how to run this place together without either of us having agreed to that arrangement out loud. She was not sure whether that was a good thing or a complicated one. She suspected it was both. Thomas's cough was small, as she'd said, but she watched it the way she watched everything concerning him, with a focused, steady attention that she had learned to make look casual, because she'd found that visible worry made Samuel worry more, and Samuel worrying more did not help Thomas. So she kept her face neutral and her hands busy, and she monitored the cough with the same practical approach she brought to everything: gather information, make the assessment, act on what you know. She made him a steam tent with a pot of hot water and a blanket draped over the chair, and she sat with him while he breathed the warm air and looked at her with his serious, considering eyes. And she talked to him quietly about nothing in particular: the weather, the names of the horses, a story she half invented about a rabbit who lived under the porch, because she had read somewhere, or been told by someone, that babies benefited from being spoken to even when they couldn't understand the words, and because talking to Thomas was one of the only times she allowed herself to say things without calculating their effect first. You're going to be fine, she told him, which was both a medical assessment and something else she didn't examine too closely. You've already proven you're tougher than you look. You got that from somewhere, I expect. Thomas grabbed her finger and held it with the complete conviction of someone who had decided this was theirs. She let him hold it. Pete came back from town with most of the list and a piece of information he delivered to Samuel, who delivered it to Clara that evening, with the careful, neutral tone of someone who wasn't sure how she'd receive it. Harlan Graves was in town today, Samuel said. Pete saw him at the land office. Clara set down the ladle she'd been using. The land office. That's what Pete said. She thought about that. The land office was not where you went when you wanted to visit a grieving family. It was not where you went to express concern about a child's welfare. It was where you went when you wanted to establish a legal position about something. Has he filed anything? She asked. Pete didn't know. He didn't ask. You might want to find out. Samuel looked at her steadily. I know that. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. She picked the ladle back up. Because men like Harlan Graves don't make trips to the land office to look at the scenery. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Outside, the snow had tapered to a light fall, the worst of it having moved through during the afternoon, and the ranch was settling into the particular hush of a property buried under several fresh inches of white. What do you think he wants? Samuel asked. It was not a question she'd expected from him, not because he was incapable of asking for another person's opinion, but because he had not, up to this point, asked for hers on anything outside the management of the house. She considered the question honestly. I think he wants Thomas, she said, not because he loves him, because Thomas is the last piece of Margaret, and controlling that piece is the closest he's going to get to controlling what he couldn't control while she was alive. Samuel's face did something complicated that she didn't try to read too precisely. That's a hard thing to say, he said. It's what I think. It's probably right. He looked down at the table. Margaret didn't trust him. She didn't say that in so many words, but she made sure everything here was in my name. Every deed, every record. She was very particular about it. He paused. I didn't understand why at the time. I thought she was just organized. She understood him, Clara said. People who grew up with someone usually do. Samuel nodded slowly. He looked tired, the particular tiredness that wasn't about sleep, but about the ongoing weight of things. I'll go to the county seat next week, he said. Talk to a lawyer, find out where things stand. That's a good idea. He looked up at her. You could have said I told you so. I didn't tell you anything you didn't already know. I just said it before you said it to yourself. The edge of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Getting closer, though. I'll have supper on in 20 minutes, Clara said, because she had learned that there was a point in certain conversations where saying the next true thing was less useful than offering something practical, and she thought they had reached it. He stood, and he said thank you, which he had not said to her before in quite that tone. Not the reflexive thank you of an employer to an employee, but the direct plain thank you of one person to another. She received it with a nod and turned back to the stove. After he left, she stood in the kitchen alone for a moment and allowed herself to feel the weight of what she was carrying here. Not the work. The work was manageable. She had always been competent at work. But the other thing. The watching and the assessing and the quiet, ongoing calculation of what was coming toward this house and how to be ready for it. She thought about Harlan Graves at the land office. She thought about what leverage looked like when it wore the face of family concern. Then she put the bread in to warm and set the table and called for Rosie, and the evening continued. The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that don't announce themselves as important while they're happening. They were made of ordinary things, meals and chores, and the daily management of a ranch coming through its first hard winter, understaffed and behind on repairs. Thomas learning to pull himself to standing, and then promptly sitting down hard on the floor with an expression of profound betrayal. Samuel coming in from the cold with mud on his boots, and thoughts on his face that he was working out how to say. Rosie presiding over the kitchen on the mornings Clara had other things to see to. Declan, the younger ranch hand, tested her once. In the way that young men sometimes test women they're not sure how to categorize. He was not malicious about it. He was simply accustomed to a particular kind of household dynamic, where the woman who ran the kitchen was someone you could charm into extra portions and overlook when she told you something needed doing. He arrived 40 minutes late to supper one Tuesday without explanation and helped himself to the food that had been set out for the others. Clara said clearly and without heat that in this house supper was at 6 and the food was set for 6, and if he was going to be late, he needed to say so in advance so arrangements could be made. Declan grinned at her. "Yes, ma'am," he said, in the tone of a person who is agreeing with you specifically to indicate that they are not really agreeing with you. She looked at him for a moment. "I'm serious, Declan." "I can see that." "Good." She went back to what she was doing. He was on time the next evening, and the evening after, and the evening after that, and the grin he gave her the fourth evening was a different kind entirely. The specific grin of a young man who has reassessed someone and is doing it cheerfully. Pete noticed. "You handled that well," he said, a few days later when they happened to be in the same part of the barn at the same time. "I didn't handle anything," Clara said. "I just meant what I said." Pete was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man choosing his words. "Declan's not a bad kid. He just needs to know where things stand." "Most people do." Pete looked at her with a considering kind of respect. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd keep her head down. Young woman, new job, stranger's house." He shrugged. "Most people would have let Declan do as he pleased. Easier." "Easier isn't always better." "No," Pete agreed. "It isn't." He went back to his work. Clara went back to hers. But she thought about what he'd said. "You're not what I expected." And she thought about the specific exhaustion of spending your entire life being something other than what people expected. And she thought about whether that was something she chose or something that had been decided for her a long time ago, in a different house, learning a different set of survival calculations. She did not arrive at a clean answer. She rarely did. But she thought it was worth asking. December arrived, and with it a kind of rhythm that settled over Bell Ranch the way snow settles over a field, gradually, until you look up and realize the whole shape of the place has changed. Clara had reorganized the kitchen stores and the cleaning schedule and the method by which the laundry was managed, not through announcement, but through the simple process of doing things a better way and letting the results speak. She had gotten the east shutters properly repaired with Samuel's help on a clear Saturday when the temperature climbed enough to work outside without losing fingers. She had found, in the back of the storeroom, a collection of preserving jars from what must have been Margaret's last productive autumn, and she had carefully inventoried them and worked them into the winter meal planning. She had not opened the chest in the back bedroom. She had seen it once, when she'd been looking for extra blankets, and understood from the quality of its placement, careful, deliberate, slightly set apart from everything else, that it was not hers to touch. She mentioned it to Rosie, who confirmed it had been Margaret's. "He hasn't opened it either," Rosie said. Not since the funeral. Clara nodded and said nothing more about it. There were things in this house she was tending and things in this house she was leaving alone, and she understood the difference instinctively, the way you understand which doors are meant to stay closed. Not because you're forbidden from them, but because the person who lives here isn't ready to open them yet. Samuel came to the kitchen one evening in early December with something he clearly wanted to say and was working up to saying. Clara recognized the specific quality of that silence. The one where a person sits down across from you and asks about something ordinary, and you can tell that's not what they're here about. She poured him coffee and waited. "Thomas said your name today," he said, finally. She looked up. "Or something close to it. Claire." "He said Claire." Samuel was looking at his coffee cup. "He said da a few times, and he said what might be Rosie, though Rosie claims it's just random syllables." A pause. "But this was deliberate. He was looking at you, and he said Claire." Clara did not say anything for a moment. There was something pressing at the back of her throat that she was not going to allow to become anything audible. "He's a smart baby," she said. "He is." Samuel looked up from his cup. "Clara, you don't have to say anything." "I want to." She waited. "What you've done here," he said slowly, like a man picking his way across uncertain ground, It's not only the cooking and the house. I want you to know I understand that. What you did the night Thomas was sick. What you've been doing every day since. The way he stopped. He lights up when you walk in the room. He's a baby. They light up at most things. He doesn't light up at me the way he lights up at you. He said it without self-pity, just a plain statement of fact. I know that's partly because I'm not here enough. I've been using the ranch as a reason to stay out of the house. And I know that, and I'm not proud of it. Clara looked at him. "I'm working on it," he said. "I know you are." "How do you know that?" "Because you're in here telling me about it, instead of outside pretending there's nothing to tell." He held her gaze for a moment, something in his face that was more undefended than she was used to seeing from him. "You have a very inconvenient way of being right about things," he said. "I've been told." He drank his coffee. She sat across from him and drank hers, and the kitchen was quiet and warm, and outside the temperature was dropping towards something serious, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with anything, and that, Clara thought, was a particular kind of comfort she hadn't experienced very often, the kind where you didn't have to perform. She was aware, sitting there, that she was in considerable trouble. The emotional kind. The kind you don't notice arriving because it comes in through the same door as all the ordinary things. The notes in the morning, and the conversations in the kitchen, and the man's face when his son said a new word, and the way a house that had been cold was learning how to be warm again. She did not say any of this. She drank her coffee and watched the fire and told herself she was a sensible person, and sensible people did not fall in love with their employers, and certainly not with the memory of what their employers had been before grief had carved them hollow, and certainly not with the slow, uncertain process of watching someone come back to themselves. She told herself this firmly. It did not help as much as she would have liked. 2 days later, Harlan Graves came back. This time, he didn't come alone. He brought a woman with him. Margaret's mother, Clara gathered from the introduction. A stout, dark-dressed woman named Vera, who looked at Bell Ranch the way you look at a property you are in the process of deciding you have a claim to. She looked at Clara longer and with a more specific kind of assessment. "So this is the girl," Vera said, to Harlan, not to Clara. "Mrs. Graves," Samuel said, and his voice had gone to the cool, controlled register Clara had heard before. "You're welcome to visit Thomas. That's what we agreed." "Of course." Vera looked at Clara again. "Does she live here?" "She manages the household." "I see." Vera's tone made of those two words a complete editorial. "Margaret's boy is being raised by a stranger." "Thomas is being raised by his father," Samuel said, "in his own home. His mother's family is not strangers." Harlan spoke for the first time, and Clara noted the practiced patience in his voice, the tone of a man who had decided in advance not to seem agitated, because seeming agitated would undermine the performance of reasonableness he was giving. "We're simply concerned. A young, unmarried woman living in a house with a widower, caring for a child. People talk, Samuel. I've said this before. And I've answered it before. The answer doesn't change what people say." Harlan looked at Clara for the first time directly. No offense to you, miss. Clara had been standing near the kitchen doorway, which was where she had positioned herself when she heard them arrive. Close enough to be present, far enough to make clear she wasn't inserting herself. She met Harlan's gaze without either aggression or apology. None taken, she said pleasantly. What's your family? Vera asked. Where are you from? Ohio originally. My father worked in manufacturing. My mother kept the house. Do you have references? Mr. Bell engaged me through an advertisement. I provided references at that time. She paused, just briefly. Mr. Bell found them satisfactory. There was a short silence in which Vera looked at Samuel, who looked back at her with the expression of a man who was being very deliberate about what he was choosing to do with his face. I'll bring Thomas down, Clara said, if you'd like to see him. She looked at Vera, not Harlan. He's just had his afternoon rest and he's in a good mood. He likes to show people how he can stand up. Something shifted in Vera's expression. The first crack in the performance, a real thing coming through. She loved this child. Whatever else was true about her motives, she had loved her daughter and she loved this baby, and that was not nothing. Yes, Vera said. I'd like that. Clara went upstairs and got Thomas and carried him down and watched him perform his current best trick for his grandmother, and watched Vera's face go soft in a way that Harlan's never did, and thought, this is the complication. The people who are being used as weapons often don't know they're being used. That evening, after the visitors left, Samuel found her in the kitchen. You handled that well, he said. I let Vera see Thomas. That's what she came for. You made her feel welcome. You didn't have to do that. She's his grandmother. Clara began clearing the supper things. She's not the problem. No, Samuel agreed. She's not. Harlan uses her. Uses her grief and her love for Thomas as a reason to keep coming here, keep inserting himself. But she's not calculating about it. She genuinely wants to be part of Thomas's life. Clara stacked the plates. You should let her, on terms you control, not his. Samuel was quiet. It takes something from Harlan if you do it first, she said. If you invite Vera yourself. If you make it a decision you made, not a concession you gave into. That's... He stopped. You think like a lawyer. I think like someone who's had to be careful about who held the advantage in a room. She looked at him. You're not powerless here, Samuel. You have the law. You have the deeds. You have a healthy son who clearly thrives in this house. Don't let him make you feel like you're on the defensive. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. When did you figure all of this out? Which part? Any of it. The part about Vera, the part about Harlan, the part about how to handle people who come in looking reasonable and wanting something. Clara thought about this honestly. Young, she said. I figured most of it out young. He didn't ask what she meant. She thought he understood. The week before Christmas, Rosie fell. Not badly. Not a break. Not something that put her in serious danger, but badly enough. She caught her foot on the bottom step coming down to breakfast, went down on her hip, and sat on the floor of the hallway with a stunned expression and tears in her eyes that were more from shock than pain, though there was pain too, enough that she couldn't stand without help. Clara heard the sound and was there in under a minute. She got down on the floor beside Rosie and talked to her calmly and helped her assess what hurt and what moved and what didn't, and determined that nothing was broken, but that the hip was bruised seriously and the ankle had been wrenched, and Rosie was not going to be managing the stairs for a while. They settled Rosie into the small room off the kitchen, which was on the ground floor and would save her from the stairs. Samuel came in from outside when he heard, and went pale in a different way than he'd gone pale with Thomas. Less terror, more the specific distress of a person losing another thing they relied on. She'll be all right, Clara told him. She needs rest and warmth and to stay off that ankle. What does she need? I've got what she needs. Clara turned from him back to Rosie. Can I get you some tea? Something to eat? I'm not an invalid, Rosie said, with the distinct sharpness of someone who is embarrassed by the situation and is dealing with that by being prickly. I know you're not. I'm asking about tea, not about whether you can manage your own affairs. Rosie looked at her. The sharpness softened, slightly. Tea would be fine, she admitted. Clara made the tea and brought it and sat with Rosie for 20 minutes. And when she came back to the kitchen, Samuel was still there, which surprised her. I can manage, she said. Both of them, the house, Thomas, Rosie. I can manage. I know you can. You look like you're calculating whether to believe that. I'm calculating, he said, how one person manages all of this. The same way one person manages most things, one step at a time. She began preparing Thomas's supper. I'm going to need you to take over with Thomas in the mornings for a bit. Just the first hour while I get the house going. Can you do that? He blinked. She suspected no one had asked him to do something so specific with his son since the child was born. Yes, he said. I can do that. Good. She handed him a small bowl. Start now. He's awake, and he'll want his supper. He took the bowl. He stood there a moment with it in his hands, looking at it like a person who has been given a responsibility they know matters and are deciding whether they're equal to it. He likes to feed himself, Clara said. He'll make a mess. Let him. Samuel looked up at her. Something moved across his face, gratitude and something else, something she wasn't ready to name, and he probably wasn't ready to give a name to either. All right, he said. She listened to him go upstairs. She listened to Thomas's sound of recognition when his father came in. Not the bright, uncomplicated joy the baby showed her, but something different, something that was learning how to be that, coming from somewhere that had been carefully closed. She heard Samuel's voice, low and uncertain, talking to his son the way you talk when you're not sure you're doing it right, but you're going to keep trying anyway. She turned back to the stove. There was no dramatic moment in it, no music, no resolution, no clean before and after. Just a man upstairs with his son, and a woman in the kitchen making supper for a household she had come to without being invited and stayed in because she was needed and because, against her most sensible intentions, it had started to feel like hers. That was the honest truth of it. And outside, the cold sat hard on Bell Ranch, and the horses shifted in the barn, and the stovepipe sent its thin thread of smoke up into the dark Wyoming sky. And inside, all the small, imperfect, important things continued. Christmas came and went quietly at Bell Ranch, the way holidays come and go in houses that are still working out what they are. Samuel had cut a small pine from the edge of the north pasture and brought it inside without ceremony, leaning it against the wall in the front room and looking at it with the expression of a man who had done something impulsive and was reconsidering. Thomas, when he saw it, grabbed the lowest branch with both hands and pulled with the complete conviction of someone who had decided this was his. The tree listed badly to one side. Samuel caught it. Clara stood in the doorway watching, and when Samuel looked at her with a helpless kind of expression, she could not entirely suppress a smile. I have some ribbon, she said, and dried berries from the preserves. That's enough? For this year, she said. It's enough. Rosie, still managing her hip from the ground floor room, directed the decorating from her chair with the authority of a general who had been sidelined but had not in any way relinquished command. Clara strung the ribbon. Samuel attempted to hang a berry cluster and got it crooked, and Clara straightened it, and they stood next to each other for a moment looking at the finished thing, which was modest and somewhat lopsided and was, in that particular way of imperfect things made by people trying, genuinely lovely. Thomas grabbed the ribbon. They spent the better part of 10 minutes relocating it above his reach. It was the most ordinary hour Clara had spent in a long time, and she was aware of it in the way you are aware of things that won't stay. Holding it lightly, not too tight, the way you hold something that belongs to the moment and not to you. January arrived without mercy. It announced itself on the second day of the new year with a storm that came out of the northwest and hit Bell Ranch the way storms hit things they've decided to take seriously. By mid-morning, the visibility was bad enough that you couldn't see the barn from the kitchen window, and the temperature was dropping into territory that turned exposed skin into a liability inside of 10 minutes. The men worked in shifts, checking the livestock, keeping the barn access clear, hauling water before the troughs could freeze solid. Clara managed the house and kept the stoves going and cooked the kind of food that generated warmth. Heavy soups, bread, the dried apple preserves that Rosie supervised her through making 2 weeks earlier. She brought food to Rosie, who was improving but still slower than she liked, and she brought Thomas through his days with the extra layer of attention that cold weather required, watching for the return of the cough that had troubled him in November. It didn't come back. Not in January, not in early February. It came back on a Thursday night in the middle of February, and this time it was different. She knew, in that way she had developed over months of paying close attention to this specific child, that something was wrong before she could articulate why. He'd been fussy at supper, which was not unusual for a 10-month-old, but the quality of the fussiness was off. Less the ordinary protest of a baby tired or bored, and more something she couldn't name, something that made her check his temperature with the back of her wrist when she put him down and find it elevated enough to make her pause. She checked him again at 9, when she normally confirmed he was. The fever had climbed. She stood over his crib in the dark and listened to his breathing and felt the fear come in the way it did when it was real. Not the cold, clean fear that clarified your thinking, but the particular dread that settled in your chest and made your hands want to shake. She did not let her hands shake. She picked him up and went to find Samuel. He was still up, at the table in the front room with his ledger, which he worked on in the evenings with the focused grimness of a man who was managing numbers that did not yet add up the way he needed them to. He looked up when she came in and read her face before she said anything. "Thomas." He was already standing. "Fever. Breathing's not bad yet, but I don't like how fast it came on." She kept her voice even. "We need the doctor." Samuel looked at the window. Outside, the storm that had been building since afternoon had arrived. Not as severe as January's, but serious. The wind was loud against the glass. The pass into town would be difficult, and possibly worse than difficult. "I'll go," he said immediately. "Samuel." She said his name, and he stopped. "Listen to the wind." He listened. "I'm not saying don't go," she said carefully. "I'm saying think about how long it will take you and whether Thomas can wait that long, and then decide." It was the hardest kind of calculation, and she knew it, and she was asking him to make it clearly instead of on pure panic. She watched him do it, watched him stand very still and force his mind to work instead of just react. "How bad is he?" Samuel asked. "Not critical yet. I think we have a few hours before that question gets urgent. I want to do what I can do here while you get the doctor, and I want you to ride fast and ride careful and come back with him. What if the pass? Deal with the pass when you get to it." She was already moving back toward Thomas. "Go now. Every hour matters." Samuel got his coat. She heard him call to Pete, heard the brief exchange in the cold of the back porch, heard the barn door, and then hoofbeats disappearing into the dark and the wind. Then it was just her and Thomas and Rosie, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown and one of Clara's shawls, moving stiffly but alert. "Tell me what to do," Rosie said. Clara told her. They worked through the first hour with the kind of focused, wordless efficiency that two competent people find when the situation doesn't allow for anything else. Rosie heated water, brought cloths, managed the kitchen stove to keep the temperature stable. Clara held Thomas and worked on the fever the same way she had in October, methodically, without letting herself think beyond the next step, keeping her hands steady through will. Thomas was more distressed this time. That was the difference that frightened her most. In October, he had gone quiet, gone inward, the illness pulling him down into something passive. Now he was fighting it, crying in that high, thin way that meant pain or fear or both, arching away from the cold cloths even as she held him still, unable to understand why the person he trusted most was doing something that felt wrong to him. "I know," she kept saying. "I know. I'm sorry. Stay with me." He wouldn't settle in her arms. He kept twisting, kept crying, and she kept her hold on him and talked to him, and the fear in her chest grew louder, and she told it to be quiet. Around midnight, Rosie came to stand beside her. "His color," she said quietly. Clara looked. The flush of fever had deepened to something that made the breath catch. "I see it," Clara said. She made a decision. "We need steam. Get the biggest pot you can manage and get it going on the stove. I'll make a tent." "Like last time?" "Bigger. And I'm going to need you to sit with him while I do it, because I need both hands." Rosie took Thomas from her without hesitation. He protested, squirming, and Clara moved to the kitchen with the quick, economical motion of someone who has decided that speed matters more than anything else. She built the steam tent over the kitchen table, the way she'd done before but larger, with 2 chairs and every blanket she could pull from the hall chest without depleting Thomas's bed. She arranged it so there was room for her to sit inside it with him, the pot of steaming water on the table beside them, the blanket draped over everything to hold the warm, wet air. When she took Thomas back from Rosie and carried him into the tent and settled with him on her lap, he cried harder for a moment, the protest of a child who doesn't understand the thing being done to them. And then, gradually, as the warm air worked on him, the crying changed quality, became less frantic, became exhausted. She talked to him the whole time. She told him about the rabbit under the porch, the one from the story she'd invented months ago, and she elaborated on it, gave the rabbit a name, Carl, for no reason other than it came to her, gave it a family and a particular habit of stealing dried corn from the stores, described its various adventures with the detail of someone who is creating a world out of nothing, because the world they're in is too frightening to stay in fully. Thomas listened. His breathing slowed. She did not let herself think, what if it doesn't work? She stayed in the tent and told the story of Carl the rabbit and held the boy and listened to each breath and counted each one as a small, separate victory. 2 hours passed. She didn't know when Rosie sat down in the chair nearest the tent. When she heard her there, she didn't look up, just knew she was present. There was a quality of another person being in the room that was different from emptiness, and she was grateful for it, though she didn't say so. At some point after 2 in the morning, Thomas stopped fighting her. He didn't go limp the way he had in October. This was different, less like surrender and more like decision. The decision of a body that has been fighting and is choosing to rest instead. He put his head against her chest and breathed, and she put her hand on the back of his head and held it there and breathed with him. The steam rose around them. The blanket held the warmth. She pressed her lips to the top of his head, which she had not allowed herself to do before, in all these months. Had always held herself back from that particular gesture, the one that would have said too plainly what she felt. She did it now without thinking. I was too tired to notice. When Samuel came through the back door at 3:30 with a gray-faced, thoroughly wind-blown doctor behind him, Clara was still in the tent, Thomas asleep against her shoulder, the fever having broken in the last 20 minutes in that unmistakable way. The sheet of sweat, the sudden stillness, the breathing finding its normal rhythm again. Samuel stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the arrangement, the blanket tent, the 2 women, the sleeping child, and something in his face broke open in a way she had seen before, that night in October, his forehead going to the edge of the table. He controlled it this time, but just barely. He's past the worst of it, Clara said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. But have the doctor look at him anyway. The doctor, whose name was Lyndon, and who had the no-nonsense manner of someone who had been pulled out of bed in a snowstorm before and bore you no personal ill will about it, examined Thomas with professional thoroughness and confirmed what Clara had already determined. Croup, he said, though a serious presentation. She had done the right things. The steam tent had likely been the difference. Samuel stood in the corner of the kitchen while the doctor spoke, and he kept his eyes on his son, and he did not say anything. After Lyndon had gone, with warm coffee in him and a reasonable payment and Clara's earnest thanks, and after Rosie had gone back to her room moving slower than she had at midnight, Samuel and Clara were alone in the kitchen with Thomas between them, the baby asleep on the kitchen table on a folded blanket, his breathing even and steady. I know what the county thinks, and I know what Harlan thinks, and I know that none of it is your fault and none of it is fair. I know I asked you here to cook and manage a house, and instead you've been keeping my family alive. He paused. I've been careful with what I say to you, with what I let myself think, because you work for me and because Margaret. He stopped, looked at the table, looked back up. Because I didn't think I had the right. Samuel, I'm not finished. She closed her mouth. I don't know what to offer you, he said. I have a ranch that's behind on everything and a son who seems determined to give me gray hair, and I'm not easy to live with. I know that. I've been gone for myself for more than a year and I'm still finding my way back, and that's not a good condition for. He shook his head slightly. But I want you to know that I see you, not what you do here, you. And I'm grateful doesn't cover it, but I don't have better words yet. Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about what Rosie had said months ago. The temperature can shift without warning. She thought about her own rule, 1 foot back, 1 eye on the exit. Then she thought about Thomas's weight against her chest and the way Samuel's voice had cracked that first night and held together through stubbornness, and the notes on the table in the morning, and the almost smiles that were becoming actual ones, and the hour she'd spent beside a pine tree with ribbon in her hands, feeling, against all her planning, at home. I'm not going anywhere, she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise of anything she couldn't guarantee. It was the truest thing she could say without overreaching, the specific honesty of a person who had learned to mean exactly what they said and no more. Samuel looked at her. He nodded, once. Thomas stirred, made a small sound, resettled without waking. They both looked at him. The stove ticked. The wind outside had dropped to something less aggressive. Still present, but manageable, the storm having said what it came to say. "Get some sleep," Clara said. "I'll be here." "I know," he said. "That's—" He stopped. "I know." He stood and checked Thomas's forehead with his hand and stood over him for a moment the way she had stood over him countless times, just watching him breathe, needing the confirmation of each breath. Then he went upstairs and Clara drew her chair closer to the table and she was alone with Thomas and the stove and the quiet. She sat there a long time, not thinking about what Samuel had said or about what she had said back or about what any of it meant in practical terms. Just sitting. Just being present in the room where the child was sleeping and the fire was going and the crisis had passed. At some point, she put her head down on her folded arms on the edge of the table, close enough to hear Thomas breathe. She did not mean to sleep. She was nonetheless asleep within 10 minutes. When she woke, daylight was coming through the kitchen window, and there was a blanket over her shoulders that had not been there before. Thomas was still sleeping on the table. The stove had been freshly stoked. She could feel the new warmth of it. She heard footsteps above her, and then Samuel's careful tread on the stairs. She did not look up when he came in. She adjusted the blanket around her shoulders and watched Thomas and waited until she had assembled herself into something that could function. "Coffee?" Samuel asked from the stove. "Please," she said. He made it without talking, which she appreciated. He set a cup in front of her and sat down across from her, and they both looked at the baby between them, sleeping with the bottomless ease of someone whose body has finished fighting. "He looks better," Samuel said. "He does." "You look terrible." Clara looked up. "Thank you." His mouth moved. This time it completed itself. A real smile, whole and unguarded. The first one she'd seen that had nothing held back in it. It changed his face, made him look younger and less like a man carrying weight he'd forgotten how to put down. She looked back at her coffee before she did something inadvisable. "I need to see about Rosie," she said, "and the men will want breakfast." "I can manage breakfast." She looked at him. "I can manage eggs," he amended, "and bread, if it's already made." "There's bread from yesterday." She stood. The blanket fell from her shoulders. "Don't let Thomas out of your sight." "I won't. And if his temperature goes up again, I'll get you immediately. And the eggs. Don't rush the heat. They go rubbery if you rush the heat." He looked at her with a patience that was only slightly strained. "Clara, I will manage the eggs." She gathered herself and went to see about Rosie, and behind her she heard Samuel talking to Thomas, who had woken and was announcing this fact with his usual directness, and she heard Samuel's voice go warm and patient in the way it was learning to go, the way she had watched it learning all these months, and she walked down the hall to Rosie's room and knocked gently and did not let herself stand in the hallway, listening to those sounds the way she wanted to. Rosie was better, well enough to be irritated about her situation, which Clara had come to understand was how you knew Rosie was genuinely all right. She helped her to the kitchen and got her settled, and by then Samuel had produced eggs that were, to be fair, not rubbery, and the men came in from the morning chores stamping cold off their boots. And Declan gave Thomas a piece of bread crust to chew on, which Thomas accepted with enormous seriousness. And Pete said he'd checked the barn, and everything was solid, and Rosie drank her coffee and commented that the eggs were better than expected. "Better than expected," Samuel repeated. "I'm not given to excessive praise," Rosie said. "Ask anyone." "I've noticed," he said. It was ordinary. It was the most ordinary possible morning. Clara stood at the stove and watched all of it and thought, this is what you fight for. Not the dramatic moments, not the declarations in the kitchen at 4 a.m. with a sick child between you. This. The eggs and the bread and the cold being stamped off boots, and the old woman with the sharp tongue, and the baby with the piece of bread, and the man learning how to be present again. This was the thing worth protecting. She turned back to the stove and thought about Harlan Graves, who was still out there, and what he had filed or was planning to file at the land office, and what shape the next confrontation would take. She thought about it with a clarity that was not fearless. She was afraid. She had been afraid for weeks, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But that was no longer paralyzed. She had stayed through a fever in October, and a blizzard in January, and a croup attack in February. She had made herself indispensable, not through strategy, but through presence, through competence, through the simple, stubborn fact of showing up and doing what needed doing. She was not going anywhere. Harlan Graves could file whatever he wanted to file. He could bring Vera and her dark dresses and her assessments. He could come with his reasonable voice and his patient eyes and his very considered opinion that someone like Clara Doyle had no place in this house. She had heard all of that before, in one form or another. She had heard it from people who thought her too young, too plain, too poor, too unconnected, too female, too much and not enough in all the specific ways that women like her were always too much and not enough. She had managed to be here anyway. She intended to keep managing it. Samuel came to stand beside her at the stove. Not close, not in a way that would have meant something it wasn't yet time to name, but close enough that she was aware of him the way she was always aware of him. "Rosie's giving Declan advice on his egg technique," he said quietly. "He'll be better for it." "He doesn't look like he thinks so." "He'll think so later." She didn't look up from what she was doing. "Give Thomas another piece of bread if he wants it. It'll keep him occupied." "Already done." She nodded. He didn't move away. They stood like that for a moment, side by side in the kitchen, the noise of the breakfast table behind them, the cold outside and the warmth inside, and everything that had been said in the night and was now living between them quietly, neither of them pulling it into the light, but neither of them putting it away. Then she handed him a spoon and said, "Stir that." And he took it without comment and stirred, and the morning continued around them, imperfect and real, and theirs. The letter arrived on a Monday in early March, which was still winter in Wyoming, regardless of what the calendar said. Pete brought it in from town along with the weekly supplies, and he set it on the kitchen table with the particular careful neutrality of a man who has read the return address and knows it means something, but understands it's not his business to say so. Clara saw the name on the envelope before Samuel did. Harlan Graves, Esquires, care of a law office in the county seat, the handwriting formal and deliberate, in the way that formal and deliberate handwriting is when someone wants you to understand they have engaged professional assistance. She left it on the table and went to find Samuel. He read it in the front room, standing, while she waited in the doorway. She watched his face go through several things in the space of about 90 seconds. Confusion first, then comprehension, then a controlled anger that he kept controlled with visible effort. He lowered the letter. "He's petitioning for guardianship," Samuel said. His voice was level in the way that voices are level when the person using them has decided that loudness would be a concession. Not full custody, shared guardianship. He's framing it as being in Thomas's best interests given. He glanced at the letter again. Given the unstable and irregular household situation. Clara did not say anything. "He's named you," Samuel said. "Not by name. He's referred to the presence of an unrelated female of unclear standing in the household." "I expected that." Samuel looked at her. "You expected this specific thing?" "I expected something like it. Men like Harlan don't make multiple trips and land office visits and then stop. They build. They gather the pieces until they have enough to present as a reasonable case." She came into the room and sat down because standing in the doorway was a posture she'd been using since October and she was tired of it. "Can I read it?" He handed it to her. She read it carefully, the way she read everything that mattered, not for the surface meaning, which was clear enough, but for the shape underneath. What he was actually claiming. What evidence he would need to support it. Where the weak points were. There were weak points. There were always weak points in documents assembled by people who were confident they had the advantage. "He's citing the February illness," she said. "He's saying Thomas suffered a serious medical crisis that was inadequately managed." "Inadequately? You saved his life. Lyndon said so." "Lyndon said I did the right things. Harlan is framing it as evidence that a child in this household requires more professional oversight." She kept reading. "He's also citing your work schedule. The hours you spend with the cattle versus the hours spent with Thomas. He's trying to construct a picture of a child left primarily in the care of a hired woman with no medical training and no formal relationship to the family." Samuel sat down across from her. He put his hands flat on his knees. "What do we do?" "First, you go to the county seat. This week, not next week. You talk to a lawyer, a real one, not someone Harlan has connections to. And you find out exactly what a petition like this requires and exactly how far along he is in making it stick. And second," Clara set the letter down. "Second, you ask Lyndon to write a formal statement about the February illness. What happened, what was done, what the outcome was. You want it documented by someone with credentials before Harlan gets to him first. Samuel was quiet for a moment. He'd try to get to Lyndon? He'll try to get to everyone. That's how this works. He doesn't need to turn people against you. He just needs to make them uncertain enough that they stay quiet. She met Samuel's eyes. You need people to be willing to speak plainly before they're given reason not to. Pete would speak for us, Samuel said, and Declan, the others. Yes, but the question is whether a petition for guardianship is decided by the word of ranch hands or by documentation and legal argument. She paused. It's probably both, in a place this size. The judge will know everyone involved, which is either an advantage or a problem, depending on who Harlan has spent the last several months having dinner with. Samuel absorbed this. She could see him working through it, the same process she'd been watching all winter, a man learning to think past the immediate reaction and into the actual territory. He was better at it than he'd been in November. He was better at most things than he'd been in November. There's something else, Clara said. He waited. The phrase he used, unclear standing. She chose her words carefully. He's going to keep using that. It's the most effective thing he has. A housekeeper can be dismissed. A woman with unclear standing can be characterized however he needs her to be characterized. She looked at the letter rather than at Samuel. I want you to know that I'm aware of what I am here, legally and practically. I'm not asking you for anything. But you should know that my presence here, as it currently stands, is a tool he can use, and he will keep using it. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the wind in the chimney, and Thomas, upstairs, talking to himself in the busy, purposeful way he did when he was playing alone. What are you saying? Samuel asked. I'm saying you should understand the situation completely. Whatever you decide to do about the petition, whatever strategy you use, you should make it with clear eyes about every factor. She finally looked at him. Including that one. Samuel held her gaze for a long moment. His expression was difficult to read, and she was usually good at reading him. I'm going to the county seat Wednesday, he said. I want you to write down everything you remember about February. The croup, what you did, what Lyndon said. As much detail as you can, dates, times, specifics. All right. And I want you to think about whether there are things you need, formally, legally. He said it carefully, not looking away. Whatever they are, I want you to tell me. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them put words to the thing between them, because words would have required a kind of precision that the moment wasn't ready for, but the understanding was there, plain and mutual, and she was grateful for it. I'll write it all down, she said. She wrote 4 pages that evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with Thomas asleep upstairs and Rosie working on her mending across from her and the lamp between them. She wrote with the methodical specificity she brought to everything that mattered, the timeline, the symptoms, the interventions, the outcome, what she had done and why, what Lyndon had said and when. She wrote it the way she would have wanted to read it, clearly, without sentiment, in the language of someone who had paid attention. Rosie watched her write. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, without looking up from her mending, He's going to marry you, you know. Clara kept writing. Rosie. I'm not saying it to cause trouble. I'm saying it because it's true, and because you're the type of person who pretends not to know true things until someone else says them out loud. You don't know that. I've known Samuel Bell since he was 22 years old and making poor decisions about fence placement. Rosie bit off a thread. I know when he's decided something. He doesn't talk about it. He just gets very quiet and very deliberate, and you can see him working out the details. The situation is complicated. Most worthwhile situations are. Rosie set down her mending and looked at Clara directly. You're afraid of wanting it. Clara stopped writing. You've been careful this whole time, Rosie said, not unkindly. Careful not to reach for too much. Careful to keep one foot back. I've watched you do it. It's very sensible. It's also going to make you miserable if you keep it up. Clara looked down at her pages. I've wanted things before, she said. Things I was careful about, and lost them anyway. I know. Rosie picked her mending back up. That's how wanting works. You don't get a guarantee. She paused. But Clara, you've been keeping that boy alive since October. You've been keeping this house together since November. If you can do all of that without a guarantee, I think you can manage wanting something without one too. Clara sat with that. She picked up her pen and kept writing. She did not say that Rosie was right. She didn't need to. Samuel came back from the county seat on Friday evening with the particular look of a man who has had a useful day and is still processing the full weight of what useful days can cost you. He came into the kitchen and sat down and accepted coffee and told her what the lawyer had said. The petition was real. Harlan had filed it formally 3 weeks earlier, which meant it had been sitting in the legal system while he was still making polite house calls. The dual approach, friendly family concern on one front, legal maneuver on the other, was exactly the kind of thing Clara had told herself he was doing and had hoped she was wrong about. "The lawyer says we have a strong position," Samuel said. "The deeds are in order. Thomas has medical attestation to his care. There's no evidence of neglect or instability. He says the petition is..." His word was speculative. Harlan's case depends on constructing an unfavorable picture more than on presenting actual evidence. What does he recommend? Documentation, testimony from people who can speak to Thomas's condition and care. Lyndon's already agreed to write a statement. I went to see him before I came home. He paused. He was angry, actually. Lyndon said it was a nuisance petition by a man with too much money and too much free time, and that he'd say so in writing and in person if it came to that. Something in Clara's chest loosened slightly. Good. Pete's willing, Rosie. Declan surprised me. Said he'd stand up in the county courthouse and say whatever needed saying. Samuel almost smiled. He's more reliable than he looks. People usually are, Clara said, thinking of Declan arriving on time to supper, week after week, because someone had told him clearly what was expected. There's something else. Samuel set his coffee cup down. The lawyer asked about your position here, your formal position. Clara was quiet. He said it as a practical matter, not a judgment. Samuel looked at her carefully. He said Harlan's strategy depends on a particular characterization, and the most direct way to remove that characterization is to change the situation. I understand what the lawyer was suggesting. I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. She looked at him across the table. He was not looking away. He had not been looking away from things for a while now, she realized. The gradual, imperfect process of a man coming back to himself had produced, among other things, someone who looked directly at what was in front of him. Samuel, she said, if what you're about to say comes from the lawyer's recommendation, I'd rather you didn't. He blinked. I'm not, she chose her words. I'm not a legal strategy. I understand what it would fix. I understand it would take Harlan's main argument away from him, and I understand the lawyer is right that it's the simplest solution. She kept her voice even. But I've spent my whole life being what was practical for other people's situations, and if you have something to say to me, I want it to come from you, not from a lawyer. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Fair enough. He stood up. He went to the window and stood there for a moment, his back to her, looking out at the dark of the ranch and whatever it was he was looking at when he looked at things. She waited. He turned around. I don't know how to do this, he said. I want to be honest about that. I was good at it once, or I thought I was, and then Margaret died, and I stopped being good at most things for a long time. He looked at her steadily. I'm not offering you something polished. I don't have that. What I have is a ranch that's still catching up with itself, and a son who says your name in his sleep, and he stopped. I have whatever I'm becoming. The part that's not still grieving. The part that's been watching you this whole winter. Clara did not say anything. I'm not asking because of Harlan, he said. I'm asking because I've been working up to asking since February, and I kept finding reasons to wait, and I'm done waiting. He paused. Will you marry me? It was not eloquent. It was not smooth. He had told her he didn't know how to do this, and then proven it by doing it anyway, and that was more than eloquence. She thought about Rosie's voice across the mending. You've been keeping that boy alive since October. If you can do all of that without a guarantee, I think you can manage wanting something without one too. Yes, she said. He let out a breath. She hadn't realized he was holding one. Okay, he said, which was possibly the least romantic response to an acceptance she could have imagined, and which was also so completely Samuel that she felt something in her chest that was neither fear nor calculation, but something else entirely. Okay, she agreed. He crossed to the table. He stood on the other side of it from her, which was where he usually stood, and she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and it was awkward and uncertain and real in the specific way that things are real when neither person is performing anything. He reached out and put his hand over hers on the table. His hand was large and calloused and warm. She turned hers over under his. They stayed like that for a moment, and then Thomas called from upstairs. That imperious early morning sound that meant he was awake and had opinions about it. And Clara looked at the ceiling, and Samuel dropped his head and made a sound that was halfway between a groan and a laugh, the first truly unguarded sound she'd heard from him. "I'll go," he said. "We'll both go," she said. They went upstairs together, and Thomas greeted them with the enthusiasm of someone who had important things to report and had been waiting a very unreasonable amount of time to report them. And Samuel picked him up, and Thomas grabbed his collar and looked at Clara with those serious, assessing eyes and said, with complete clarity, "Claire." "That's right," Samuel told him. "Clara." Thomas appeared to consider this. "Claire," he said again, firmly, and looked satisfied. The week that followed had the particular quality of a week that changes things and is therefore both better and harder than ordinary weeks. They told Rosie first, who received the news with the expression of someone who is pretending to be surprised as a courtesy to the people telling her. "Well," she said, "it's about time." "You're not surprised," Samuel said. "I told Clara weeks ago." Rosie turned back to the stove. "I'll make a proper supper tonight. We can call it a celebration if you like, though there's no reason to be dramatic about it." Coming from Rosie, this was approximately equivalent to organizing a parade. They told Pete next, and Pete shook Samuel's hand and nodded at Clara with the quiet warmth of a man who had watched something develop at close range and was glad it had resolved the way it had. Declan made a noise of genuine delight and punched Pete on the shoulder for no clear reason. The brothers from Nebraska looked at each other and appeared to decide this was good news, and said so in the sparse, economical way they said everything. Vera Graves appeared on the following Tuesday. She came without Harlan, which was different, and she came in the late morning, which was the hour when Thomas was usually at his best, fed, rested, in the specific excellent humor of a healthy baby who has slept well and eaten well and is ready to present his current capabilities to anyone available. She stood in the front room and accepted coffee and did not mention the petition or Harlan's name, and Clara sat across from her and let her hold Thomas, who took approximately 45 seconds to warm to her and then showed her his latest trick, which was waving. Vera's face did the thing it always did when Thomas was in her arms. Went soft, went private, became the face of a woman who had loved her daughter and was learning to love what her daughter had left behind. "He looks well," Vera said. "He's been well," Clara said. "Since the croup in February, he's had no trouble. He's been eating better, growing." Vera looked at her. The dark-dressed assessment was still there, but something in it had shifted, become less prosecutorial, more complicated. "He looks like her," she said. "Around the eyes." "I know. I've noticed." This seemed to surprise Vera. She looked down at Thomas. "You look at her portrait. It's in the hallway. I pass it every day." Clara paused. "I've never tried to replace her. I want you to understand that. What I've done here with Thomas, it wasn't to erase what she was to him. It was just to make sure he had someone present, someone consistent." Vera was quiet for a long time. Thomas waved at her again. She caught his small hand in hers. "Harlan told me the petition was for the family's benefit," she said finally. "He said it was what Margaret would have wanted. Do you believe that?" Another long silence. "I believe he believes it." She looked up at Clara. "Harlan has always been very comfortable believing that what's good for him is good for everyone else." Clara said nothing. "I didn't know he'd filed it," Vera said. "He told me after, said it was a precaution." She smoothed Thomas's hair, which promptly went back to being unsmooth. "I told him it was a mistake." "What did he say?" "That I didn't understand the legal situation." Vera's mouth thinned. "Harlan tells me frequently that I don't understand things. It's become somewhat predictable." Clara looked at this woman, this complicated, grieving, used woman, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel toward her, which was a specific kind of recognition. Vera was not a villain. She was a mother who had lost her daughter and been handed, by her son, a cause to believe in, and the cause was real enough that she'd accepted his framing of it without examining it too carefully. Clara understood that. She understood it exactly. "Vera," she said quietly. "Samuel and I are to be married." Vera looked up. I'm telling you directly because I respect you and because Thomas is your grandchild and I want us to be able to be in the same room without fighting. Clara held her gaze. I'm not his mother. I'm never going to say I am. But I love him, and I intend to spend my life making sure he knows he's wanted and cared for. That's what I can offer him. She paused. And I'd like him to know his grandmother, if she's willing. The room was very quiet. Thomas had gotten hold of Vera's sleeve and was examining the button with the focused interest he brought to all new objects. Vera looked at him. When she looked back up at Clara, her eyes were bright. My daughter would have liked you, she said. It came out roughly, which Clara thought was probably why she'd been holding it back. She didn't like many people. She had very particular standards. I've heard that about her. From Rosie, I imagine. Mostly. Vera looked down at Thomas again. He'll grow up not knowing her, she said. That's the thing I can't… She stopped. He'll only know what we tell him. Then we should make sure we tell him well, Clara said. Vera made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and was somewhere in the territory between them where grief lives when it's learning to coexist with the world. She held Thomas a little tighter. He did not protest. He was busy with the button. Harlan Graves withdrew the petition on a Thursday in late March, and he did it without announcement, without explanation, through his lawyer to Samuel's lawyer, in the flat transactional language of legal documents that communicate the substance without the feeling. Samuel told Clara that evening. She was at the stove. He came in and stood behind her and said, It's withdrawn. Lyndon's statement, Rosie's statement, Pete's. Apparently Harlan's lawyer advised him the petition had insufficient grounds to proceed. Clara kept stirring what was on the stove. Also, Samuel said, Vera wrote him a letter. Lyndon told me. He didn't read it, but she apparently told him to stop. Clara set down the spoon. She turned around. Samuel looked at her. You talked to her, he said, that Tuesday. I told her the truth, about what I am here and what I'm not. She paused. She's not a bad person. She was being used by someone she trusted. I know. Samuel was quiet for a moment. She wants to come to the wedding. Clara blinked. She sent a note with her lawyer's letter, said Thomas should have his family at the wedding. He paused. I said it was your decision. Clara thought about Vera and the button and the rough, held-back voice saying my daughter would have liked you. She thought about Thomas growing up with people who could tell him about his mother. Real things, true things. The sharp-tongued woman in the portrait who told her brother his opinions were as welcome as a skunk at Sunday dinner. Tell her yes, Clara said. Samuel nodded. He did not move from the doorway. Come in or go out, Clara said. You're letting the heat out. He came in. He came all the way in, which he had been doing more and more, choosing the kitchen, choosing to be in the same room, choosing presence over the studied distance he'd maintained for so long. He sat at the table and she turned back to the stove, and the evening continued. I want to tell you something, he said after a while. Tell me. When I put that advertisement in the paper, I was doing it because Rosie told me I had to, because she couldn't manage alone anymore. I wasn't thinking about what would come. I was barely thinking about anything in those days. He paused. And then you didn't knock. Clara was quiet, stirring. You just heard Thomas and you moved toward him, Samuel said. I was standing in the kitchen not knowing what to do, and this woman I'd met 20 minutes before was already doing it. He stopped. I didn't understand then what that was. I thought it was just competence, but it wasn't only that. What was it? It was that you decided he mattered before you had any reason to decide that, before he was yours in any sense. You just decided. Clara thought about the way she'd moved down that hallway, the crying she couldn't not respond to, the thing in her that had never learned to hear need and walk past it. I didn't decide anything, she said. I just did what was in front of me. I know, Samuel said. That's what I mean. She heard him the way she heard most things he said now, all the way through, past the surface and into what was underneath. She thought she understood him, which was not the same as knowing him fully, which was not something you arrived at in 5 months with any person worth knowing. But she understood the shape of him, the grief and the stubbornness, and the notes left on tables, and the almost smiles becoming real ones, and the man upstairs learning to talk to his son in a warm, uncertain voice. She understood that she was part of the shape of him now, and that he was part of the shape of her, and that neither of them had planned it, and both of them were going to have to manage it as it came, day by day, imperfectly, the way all things worth having are managed. "Supper in 10 minutes, she said. "I'll get Thomas." "He's already in his chair. Rosie got him." "Of course she did. She's also set the table. She's going to run this house until she's 90, and none of us will be able to stop her." "No," Clara agreed. "We won't." Samuel got up from the table, and she heard him go to check on Thomas anyway, the way he did everything now. Not because he didn't trust that others had it handled, but because he wanted to be part of it, wanted to be present in the daily life of his own house, rather than moving alongside it at a careful distance. She served the supper, and they ate together around the kitchen table, all of them, Samuel and Thomas and Rosie and Clara. And it was loud in the specific way of a table with a baby at it, and Rosie argued with Declan through the window about whether he'd done the north fence properly, and Thomas put his hand in his bowl and looked at it with scientific interest, and Samuel caught Clara's eye across the table, and the look he gave her was the kind that didn't need anything added to it. Outside, the last of the winter was making its final grudging retreat. The snow was still on the ground, but it had begun to lose its conviction, and in the south-facing places there were patches of bare earth, dark and cold and waiting. Spring was not here yet, but it was coming, the way it always came, not announcing itself, not arriving with ceremony, but showing up in the gaps and the margins, in the place where the stubborn cold finally ran out of reasons to stay. They were married on a Saturday in April, when the ground had finally decided to let go of winter, and the south pasture had come up in the pale, tentative green that meant the worst was genuinely over. It was not a large wedding. Clara had not wanted a large wedding, and Samuel had not pushed for one, and between the two of them they had arrived at the specific kind of ceremony that fit the people they were, small, plain, held in the front room of Bell Ranch, with the windows open to the April air, and the pine tree long since gone, but the room itself warmer than it had been when she'd first walked into it 6 months earlier. Rosie stood on Clara's left and cried, which she would later deny. Pete stood on Samuel's right and did not cry, though his jaw was set in the manner of a man working at it. Declan had polished his boots for the occasion and looked genuinely moved in the uncomplicated way of young men who are not yet practiced at hiding what they feel. The brothers from Nebraska stood in the back with clean shirts and an air of respectful attendance. Vera Graves sat in the chair nearest the window, in a dark dress that was the same cut as always, but had, Clara noticed, a small white flower pinned at the collar. The only concession to the day, understated and deliberate. Thomas, who was 11 months old and had recently discovered that standing was achievable if you held on to something, spent the ceremony gripping the leg of Rosie's chair and looking at everyone with the considering expression that Clara had come to understand as his version of paying attention. He wore a clean shirt. Clara had ironed it herself that morning, which had taken 3 times as long as it should have because Thomas kept trying to help. The judge who performed the ceremony was a broad, unhurried man named Cutter, who had known Samuel since before Margaret, and who looked at Clara with the frank, measuring assessment of a man trying to determine what had been lost and what had been found, and whether the balance was acceptable. He looked at her through the ceremony, and she met his eyes without flinching, and at the end, when it was done, he shook her hand and said, "Welcome to Harlan County, Mrs. Bell." And there was something in it that sounded like an actual welcome. Mrs. Bell. She carried the name carefully for the rest of the day, the way you carry something new that you're not yet sure fits, turning it over, checking its weight. It fit. She had not expected it to fit so readily. She had expected something more complicated. The guilt of a woman who had come into a space that belonged to someone else. The unease of wearing a name that another person had worn first. She had braced herself for that. She found instead something simpler and stranger. The feeling of a door that had been locked for a long time opening not with fanfare, but with the ordinary click of a key that was finally the right one. The supper afterward was better than she would have admitted to planning. She had spent 2 days on it, quietly, in the hours when Samuel was outside and Thomas was sleeping, and Rosie had supervised from her chair with the authority of someone who considered herself the senior partner in any culinary enterprise and was extending the courtesy of letting Clara lead. It was good food, served on the best dishes, and they ate it together in the kitchen because the kitchen was where they all lived, and the dining room was a formal space that felt wrong for this particular day. The table was crowded. The conversation was loud in the way of people who know each other well enough to argue about small things without it meaning anything. Declan was wrong about something, as usual, and Pete corrected him, as usual, and Rosie had opinions about both of them. Vera stayed for supper. Clara had not been certain she would. But she sat at the table and accepted a plate and held Thomas when he got fussy and talked to Rosie about the county with the ease of two women who had lived in the same small world long enough to have shared history. And at one point she looked across the table at Clara and said quietly, under the noise of the others, "She would have found this funny, you know. All of it. The petition, the lawyer, the whole drama of it. She had a very particular sense of humor about men who overestimated their own importance." "It sounds like she was remarkable," Clara said. "She was difficult," Vera said. "She was stubborn, and she had a sharp tongue, and she made decisions without asking anyone's opinion, and half the time she was right, and the other half she was very committed to pretending she had been." A pause. "Yes, she was remarkable." Clara looked at Thomas, who was in Vera's arms pulling at her flower pin with great interest. "He'll know her," Clara said. "I promise you that." Vera looked at her. Whatever the look contained, it was not the assessment of the first visits. It was something that had moved past assessment into a territory that was quieter and more permanent. "I know he will," she said. That was the end of the war, if it could be called that. Not a surrender on either side. Not a formal reconciliation with speeches attached. Just a woman at a table accepting a plate of food and a promise. And both parties understanding that the thing between them had found its shape. Harlan Graves did not come to the wedding. He did not come to the supper. He sent, several weeks later, a formal note through his lawyer acknowledging the marriage and withdrawing all interest in any further legal proceedings regarding Thomas Bell. The note was cold and correct and contained not one word that was not absolutely necessary, and Clara read it and set it aside and did not spend any more time on it than it deserved. He was not, in the end, the most important thing that had happened here. He had felt like the most important thing at several points during the winter. The thread around which everything else organized itself, the pressure that had required strategy and documentation and the careful alignment of witnesses. But threats are only the frame. They are never the painting. The painting was Thomas learning to walk. He managed it on a Tuesday in mid-May in the kitchen, where he had been cruising along the edge of the table for 2 weeks, with the cautious determination of someone who is not going to attempt the open floor until he has worked out the physics to his satisfaction. Clara was at the stove. Samuel was at the table with his ledger. Rosie was in her chair. Thomas let go of the table leg. He stood, unassisted, for approximately 3 seconds. His face went through an extraordinary sequence of expressions: surprise, calculation, pride, alarm. And then he sat down on the kitchen floor with a thump. The 3 adults in the room did not make a sound. They had all learned over months that Thomas did not respond well to excessive reaction. It either startled him or made him self-conscious, and both outcomes resulted in delays. So they stayed quiet and waited. Thomas looked at the floor. He looked at his hands. He looked at Clara. She was watching him with the same still, steady attention she had given him since the night she'd heard him crying through the wall of a stranger's house. She did not clap or exclaim or make the encouraging sounds that adults made at babies accomplishing things. She just looked at him with her full attention, which was the thing he had always responded to most, being truly seen. He pulled himself back up on the table leg. Let go. 3 steps this time, lurching and wide-legged and absolute before he sat down again. "There it is," Samuel said quietly. Rosie made a sound that she covered with a cough. Thomas stood up again. 4 steps. 5. He reached the stove and grabbed Clara's skirt with both hands and looked up at her with an expression of pure, uncomplicated triumph. She picked him up. She held him against her chest and felt his small, sturdy body and the particular warmth of him and the weight that she had first lifted in a moment of fear and had been lifting ever since, through fevers and croup and cold nights and the legal machinations of men who saw him as a means to an end. "Good," she said into his hair. "Just that. Good." He grabbed her ear. She laughed. A real one, unmanaged, coming from somewhere she didn't usually let things come from, and Samuel looked up from his ledger and watched her laugh with an expression she would only let herself see from the corner of her eye, because looking at it directly still did something to her chest that she had not entirely learned to manage. Spring became summer,
and summer at Bell Ranch was work of a different kind. Harder in the body and easier in the spirit than winter had been. The long days giving the sense of abundance that dark months made easy to forget. The cattle did well. The repairs that had been deferred through the hardest months of the year got done, one by one, with the accumulated energy of people who had come through something together and were now on the other side of it. The east shutters, properly fixed now, held against the June storms without complaint. The north storeroom no longer lost heat through the gap at the base of the door. The porch steps got replaced, all of them, not just the broken ones, because Pete made a reasonable argument that the others were not far behind, and it was better to do it once than twice. Clara kept the house and the records and the schedule, and she did it differently now than she had in the beginning, with more authority and less apology, with the ease of someone who had stopped waiting for permission to know that her place here was real. She did not have a word for what she had been in October, arriving with her bag and her careful calculations. She had a word for what she was now. Several words. Wife. Mother, in the only sense that mattered, which was the daily, practical, unconditional sense. The person who knew where everything was kept and what everyone needed and how to read the temperature of the house before anyone else had noticed it had changed. She had also, quietly, over the course of the winter and spring, started keeping a different kind of record. Not the household accounts, those she had managed from the beginning, but something more personal. A small notebook she'd bought in town when she went with Samuel for supplies in April, blue-covered, which she kept in the drawer of the bedside table. She wrote in it in the evenings sometimes, when the house was quiet. Not a diary exactly. More like a running account of things worth noting. Things Thomas did, things Rosie said, the look on Samuel's face when the south pasture came up green. The small record of a life that was happening. She had not had one of those before. A life worth recording. She thought that was worth noting, even privately, even in a small blue notebook that no one else would read. Samuel found it once, not deliberately. She had left it on the table and he came in and saw it and picked it up before he realized what it was. He set it down immediately and said, "Sorry." And she said, "It's all right." And he said, "I didn't read it." And she said, "I know." They stood there for a moment on either side of the small, plain fact of her having a private interior life. And then he said, "Good," in the same tone she had used with Thomas learning to walk. And she understood that he meant it exactly the same way. That was, she thought, one of the underrated things about a good marriage. The moments where you understood each other without requiring an explanation. She had not known what a good marriage looked like from the inside. Her parents' marriage had been a managed thing, held together by habit and necessity and a very limited understanding of what the alternatives were. She had grown up thinking that was what marriage was, the agreement to stay in the same house and manage the same difficulties and not make too much of either the good or the bad. What she was learning, slowly, in the months after April, was that it was also possible to be genuinely interested in the person across the table from you. To find, day after day, that you wanted to know what they were thinking, to have an argument, and they had arguments because they were both people with opinions, and the opinions did not always align, and come out the other side of it knowing each other better than before. They argued once, in July, about the east pasture, about whether to expand the herd into it or leave it fallow another season to let the grass recover. It was a real disagreement, not a small one, and they had it plainly and without either of them capitulating just to end it. Clara thought the grass needed another season. Samuel thought they couldn't afford the opportunity cost. They went 3 days without resolving it, which was uncomfortable in the specific way of disagreements that live in the same house as you. On the 4th day, Pete offered an opinion that was essentially a modified version of Clara's position delivered in the language of cattle management, and Samuel came inside and told her she had been right, and she told him she had also been looking at the numbers and understood why he disagreed, and they had a conversation about it that was better than the silence of the previous 3 days. She told Rosie about it later, not because she needed advice, but because Rosie was the person she talked to. "You backed down," Rosie said, without looking up from her knitting. I acknowledged his point. "Same thing." "It's not the same thing." Rosie looked up. "No," she admitted. "It's not." She paused. "It's better." Clara understood what she meant. There was a kind of backing down that came from not believing in yourself. And there was a different kind that came from believing enough in yourself that you didn't need to win every point. She had spent a lot of her life doing the first kind. She was learning, slowly, the second. Summer moved toward fall with the easy authority of seasons that know where they're going. Thomas turned 1 year old in September, a fact that Clara had been thinking about for weeks, and which arrived anyway with the specific ambush quality of things you know are coming but cannot entirely prepare for. She made a cake. It was not a spectacular cake. She was competent at cakes, but not extraordinary. And she put one candle in it, and they sat around the kitchen table, the household that had come together out of necessity and stubbornness and a series of improbable choices, and they sang to a child who had spent his first year being kept alive by people who loved him. Thomas looked at the candle with profound scientific interest, and then hit the cake with his open palm and looked enormously pleased with the result. Rosie ate her slice and said the sponge was acceptable. Coming from Rosie, this meant excellent. Vera had come for the birthday, which Clara had suggested and Samuel had arranged, and she sat at the table with the rest of them and ate the cake and laughed when Thomas ate his with both hands and held him in her lap afterward while he fell asleep against her, heavy and milk-warm and completely without concern. Before she left, she stood in the front hallway putting on her coat, and she said, "I want to ask you something." Clara waited. "Last October," Vera said, "when Harlan first came here and started, when all of this was beginning, did you know then what he was doing?" "I suspected," Clara said. "Not the specifics, but the shape of it." "Were you afraid?" Clara considered this honestly. "Yes." "But you stayed." "I stayed." Vera looked at her for a moment. She was not a soft woman, and she had not had a soft year, and there was no pretending that all of it had been resolved without cost. Margaret was still gone. Harlan was still her brother, and she still had to live with the knowledge of what he had tried to do and the part she had unwittingly played in it. Those were not small things. They didn't disappear because supper was pleasant. "Thank you," Vera said. "It was simple, and it was complete." "He's easy to love," Clara said. "Thomas. He makes it easy." "Yes," Vera said. "He does. He got that from his mother." She buttoned the last button on her coat. She would have been difficult about all of this at first. You should know that. She was territorial, and she didn't trust easily, and she would have had a great deal to say about a stranger coming into her house. She paused. And then she would have come around, because she was fair when she made herself be. And because
She loved Thomas more than she loved being right, which was the largest concession of which she was capable. Clara nodded. "I'll remember that about her." "Good." Vera went to the door, and then she stopped with her hand on the frame, and she said without turning around, "She would have liked the notebook, I think. She kept one too." Then she was out the door, and the fall air came in briefly, and the door swung shut, and Clara stood in the hallway alone for a moment under the portrait of the woman with the sideways look and the better things to do. She looked at the portrait for a long time. There were things she would never be able to give Thomas. The specific way his mother would have held him. The sound of her laugh, which no one had thought to record. The particular version of himself he would have been if she had lived. Those were permanent absences, and Clara had come, through the year, to understand that her role was not to fill them, but to make sure he knew they were real, to speak of Margaret with honesty, to let Vera be Vera in his life, to not require the story of this family to begin with her arrival. She was not the beginning of this story. She was a chapter that had come in at a hard point and found its place and stayed. She thought that was enough, more than enough. She thought that there was a particular kind of courage in that, not the dramatic courage of the crisis moment, though she had managed those too, but the daily unglamorous courage of someone who shows up and does the work and doesn't require the story to be about her in order to mean it. She had arrived at Bell Ranch a stranger with a bag and a careful system for assessing danger and a lifelong habit of keeping one foot back. She had come because she needed work, and the advertisement had been in the paper, and she had been practical enough to answer it. What she had not expected, what no practical calculation had prepared her for, was the degree to which the place would reach back. That was the thing nobody told you about belonging. You could not engineer it. You could not perform it into existence or think your way to it or protect yourself adequately against the wanting of it. It arrived in the gaps, in the weight of a baby against your chest, and the note left on the kitchen table, and the almost smile becoming a real one, and the old woman in the chair with the sharp tongue, and the man upstairs learning to be present in his own life again. It arrived in the ordinary things, or it didn't arrive at all. Clara had spent most of her life believing that a person like her, too cautious to be warm, too watchful to be easy, too familiar with the ways things could go wrong to trust that they wouldn't, was not the kind of person that belonging found. That it was for other people, easier people, people who didn't calculate the temperature of a room before deciding it was safe. She had been wrong about that. She was willing, at this point, to be wrong about it plainly and without qualification. She had been wrong, and the wrongness had cost her some months of unnecessary bracing, and she was done with it. She turned from the portrait and walked back toward the kitchen, where Samuel was doing the supper dishes because she had made the cake and he had taken on the dishes without being asked, which was the kind of thing that didn't seem large and was very large, and where Thomas was asleep in his chair with a small smear of cake on his face that she had decided to leave there until morning because he looked so entirely peaceful. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at all of it. The dishes and the man doing them and the sleeping child and the lamp on the table and the window showing the dark of a fall evening that smelled, if you opened it, of the cold coming back but not yet arrived, still a few weeks away, manageable, known. Samuel turned from the dishes and saw her in the doorway. "You're doing it again," he said. "What?" Standing in the doorway, looking at things. "I've always done that." "I know. No, I've noticed." He turned back to the dishes. "I used to wonder what you were calculating. What do you think now?" He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was actually thinking rather than just pausing. "I think you're just looking," he said, "at what's here." She came into the kitchen and picked up a dish towel and stood beside him, and they dried the dishes together and did not talk much because they had learned that talking much was not always necessary, and the lamp made its circle on the table, and Thomas slept in his chair and the house settled into its nighttime sounds around them. This was not a perfect life. She knew that as plainly as she knew anything. There would be hard winters still, and money that didn't quite add up, and arguments that took 3 days to resolve, and things she would get wrong about Thomas, and things Samuel would get wrong about her, and the particular difficulties of two stubborn people trying to share a life without losing themselves in it. There would be mornings when the weight of everything felt too much, and evenings when the fear came back out of old habit and had to be talked down. There would be seasons when the work was harder than the reward seemed to justify, and moments of genuine loss that no amount of competence could navigate. She was not afraid of any of that, or rather, she was afraid, but she understood now that fear was not a sign that the thing was wrong. Sometimes it was a sign that the thing was real, that it mattered enough to be frightening. The people in the places that don't frighten you at all are usually the ones you don't care enough about to lose. She cared about this. She cared about it in the comprehensive, inconvenient, completely committed way that she had spent most of her life trying to avoid, and she had stopped trying to avoid it. And the result was that she was standing in a kitchen on a fall evening drying dishes and feeling, with a steadiness that had nothing to do with certainty and everything to do with choice, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had not needed to become someone else to arrive here. She had needed only to keep being herself, watchful and practical and afraid when it was appropriate and steady when it was required, and to let the place and the people be what they were, which was imperfect and real and, in their imperfect and real way, hers. Samuel handed her the last dish. Their hands were close on the edge of it. "Rosie's right," he said. "About what?" "About everything, mostly. But specifically, she told me once that you were the kind of person who kept the fear separate from the working." He paused. "I've been thinking about that, about what it costs to do that, every day." Clara set the dish in the cupboard. "Someone has to." "It doesn't always have to be you." She turned and looked at him. He was looking back at her with the undefended expression she still had to remind herself she was allowed to look at directly. "I know," she said. "I'm learning that." He nodded. He did not say anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying, and they had both gotten better at knowing when that was true. She went to check on Thomas, still sleeping, the cake on his face undisturbed, his small hands open on the armrests, in the complete relaxation of a child who does not yet know how to be guarded. And she pulled the blanket up around him and stood over him for a moment the way she had stood over him 100 times, just being certain of the breathing, just marking the fact of his being there and being well. Then she blew out the kitchen lamp and followed Samuel up the stairs, and the house went dark and quiet behind them, holding everything inside it the way a good house does. Not perfectly, not without its cracks and its cold corners and its memories that lived in the hallways, but solidly, with the specific reliability of something that has been through a hard winter and is still standing. Outside, the stars were very clear over Bell Ranch in the way they get when the air goes cold and dry and there is nothing between you and the distance but the dark. The horses shifted in the barn. The last of the summer warmth was gone from the ground, but the ground itself was solid, and it would hold.